Thank you very much. Selamat sore, good afternoon. So I am going to bring us back to Indonesia and talk a bit about why investing in human capital is important, I would say essential, for Indonesia's economic transformation, and provide some options of what the Indonesian government might want to consider in order to achieve those goals. Let's see, I always struggle with this. Yes. So a lot of what I will talk about, you will recognize a similar narrative, a similar justification from a lot of what Professor Lee just talked about from the Korean experience, the importance of education, the importance of skills development, gender equity. But I will also talk, I think for the first time today, about the importance of nutrition and investing in children and in early childhood development. And I will argue that if Indonesia does not do that today, there is no way that they will be able to compete in the economy of the future. And I hope that by the end of my presentation, you might agree with me on that. There is a lot of evidence of what role human capital has in economic growth and in economic development. We know that investments in human capital are directly linked to productivity and competitiveness. As I said, we know that investments in early childhood and nutrition have large dividends for country, communities, and households. We know that for a workforce to be able to meet the labor demands of the future, it needs to have the adequate skills, both technical skills as well as soft skills. And in the case of Indonesia, improving and ensuring gender equity is also key to sustainable growth and development. And I'm listing here some of the evidence that exists. There is an abundance of evidence. This is just a few of them. One of the ones I want to highlight is in the second column, which is evidence from Indonesia that shows very strongly how important it is to invest in children and to ensure that children are not stunted. Indonesian children who were stunted in 1993, when they were surveyed again in 2014, 2015, they demonstrated much lower cognitive function when they were young adults. They had spent fewer years enrolled in education, and for those who did transition into the labor market, they were earning less. So the link is very clear. I wish that I had put also on my slides, there is a very powerful, and you might have seen it, brain scans from Professor Charles Nelson at Harvard University, who did brain scans of 6-month-old children and compared the neurological connections of stunted children and non-stunted children. And the difference is huge. You will see it very clearly. The neurological connections that the non-stunted children have are, many timefold those of the stunted children. And we know that the impact of stunting is lifelong. It's not something that you can reverse. So if a stunted child ends up being stunted, then they're going to have and to carry that mortgage for the rest of their life. There are also a few other things that I think give some evidence for Indonesia, because it's not only about stunting, it's also about education and about the quality of education. Our education team did some simulations based on the methodology developed by Hanucek, and showed that if Indonesia could increase your PISA scores by 50 points, it would increase the long-term economic growth rate by almost a percentage point, which is significant. We also know that there are significant economic losses to early marriage. In 2014, early marriage caused a loss of at least 1.7% of GDP. So I think that the why, as Ibu Menteri said this morning, the why is clear, and this is just some of the evidence that shows the why. I think there is an additional urgency that is introduced by the demographic development that Indonesia is going through, as well as something we talked a lot about today, technology. So we know that demographic trends are expected to increase GDP growth in Indonesia by close to a percentage point between 2020 and 2050. But we also know that Indonesia really risks growing old before you become rich. Therefore, to really take advantage of the demographic dividend, it requires human capital, it requires productivity investments, and it requires sufficient quality jobs, and of course, a skilled workforce to fill those jobs. In technology, I just wanted to say a few things that, we see that technology is changing the nature of work. It changes the type of jobs that are needed. It changes the skills that are needed to fill that job. And I think we've seen many examples today that technological progress places a premium on higher order skills, such as digital skills and soft skills that require a stronger focus on formal education as well as on lifelong learning. There is a projected shortage in Indonesia of about 9 million skilled and semi-skilled ICT workers expected between now and 2030. So this is a real-time problem that we're experiencing. And I also wanted to just put out a little bit of a teaser that technological advancement doesn't only require human capital, but it also really provides a great potential to accelerate human capital growth and human capital transformation, and to really use a lot of this innovative technology to accelerate the impact for the people on the ground, to accelerate the management systems that a government has at its disposal. And we'll talk a bit more about that as well. Indonesia has a human capital stock that has challenges. I think Ibu Sri Mulyani talked a bit about this morning about sort of how the investments in human capital and the focus has evolved over the years. There are, despite significant progress in educational attainment, reduction in many prevalence of many diseases, there are still several challenges that needs to be addressed for Indonesia to be ready for the future. These might look a bit provocative, but it's on purpose. It doesn't mean that all Indonesians are unhealthy, obviously, but it means that there are some very basic problems that is inhibiting your population. There is very high TB prevalence. We see, in addition to some of the sort of basic communicable diseases, there is also a very large increase in non-communicable diseases, cancer, heart disease. A lot of this is attributed to Indonesia's high smoking rates. There are 85 million smokers in Indonesia. And as we will see later, the stunting rates in Indonesia are still very high and mortgaging almost a third of your children. There is also an issue of inadequate skills of the population and of the labor force. Again, here is the number, 55% of secondary school graduates are functionally illiterate based on the latest PISA scores. And if you look at the current performance and don't improve it, it's going to take, on average, 50 years for Indonesia to reach the OECD average. And we're seeing huge disparities. So for students from poor families in remote areas, it's going to take 136 years for them to catch up to the OECD average. Gender equality, my colleague mentioned this, 50% female labor force participation rate represents, I would argue, a significant loss to the economy. Again, the high child marriage rate. And Indonesia, if you're a woman, on average, when your male colleague earns $1, you earn 70 cents. I wanted to talk a bit about the World Bank Human Capital Index, which some of you may have heard of. It was launched at the annual meetings here in Bali a couple of months ago. And it is a measure of a country's human capital. It is a simple index that uses three areas of indicators that are all directly linked to adult productivity. And they are intended, the index is intended to provide a benchmark for any country to see, okay, in 2018, this is where you are. This is what it means, we think, for what you are able to achieve in terms of growth and productivity. And this is how you compare to other countries in the world. In addition to survival rate, the two most important ones that we see for Indonesia that makes a big difference is schooling. And we're not talking about only the number of years of school a student has completed. We're talking about how much do they learn while they're in school. And then on the health side, the stunting rates are making a big difference in Indonesia. When you put all of these numbers together and there is a weighing and there is a fancy process, out comes your human capital index score. For Indonesia, the index score is 0.53, and that might not mean anything to you, so let me try to explain. It means that if you're a child born in Indonesia today, when you grow up, when you turn 18, you are likely to be 53% as productive as you could be if you had had a full and complete education and health, measured by the indicators on the previous slides. So clearly, this means that Indonesia is missing out on opportunities for the future. Just to give you a little bit of a comparison, the global average is 0.57. So Indonesia is only slightly below that. The EIP average is 0.62. The number one ranked country, any ideas, suggestions? It's in your neighborhood. Yes, Singapore. And Korea also is in top 5. So two things that I wanted to just highlight here is the learning component, which, as I said, combines the expected years of schooling and how much you learn in school. When you report it a bit differently than in this slide, what we see is that the average Indonesian completes about 12.3 years of schooling. However, he or she only learns about 9 years of schooling. And if you relate that to what Pasua said about improving the quality of spending, it means that Pasua or the Ministry of Finance or the government of Indonesia, you pay for 12 years of schooling, you only get 9 years of learning. So there is a huge potential to improve the quality of spending in the education sector. On stunting, when this was launched 2 months ago, the newest data for Indonesia using survey data showed that Indonesia had a 37% stunting rate, which meant that 37% of children would have the brain scan with the limited connectors, which we know will negatively impact how much they learn in school, how much school they complete, and how much they earn, and how much they contribute to the economy going forward. The good news is that since then, that was 2013 data, since then the 2018 data has been released, and the current number is 30.8%. Which is still much more than it should be, but it is a positive trend that needs to continue. This summarizes some of the things that Indonesia is doing at the moment. The narrative that we need to not only invest in infrastructure, but also in human capital, those are words, I would say, backed up by evidence as well. We do see significant spending on human capital-related investments. 20% of the budget on education, billions and billions of dollars of water programs, health programs, village transfers that goes all the way down to the villages and could really help as well with both economic transformation and human capital at the village level, and social protection programs. They're also implementing important reforms at large scale. And I do want to highlight the government stunting program because it's one of the most impressive programs that I've had the pleasure to work with them on. The scaling up national strategy to accelerate stunting reduction commits 22 ministries and agencies to achieve annual and very specific target, and it's a costed plan. And I've had the pleasure of sitting in one of the meetings chaired by Vice President Kalla, who leads this initiative, where he, in a very strong and I think effective way, holds his ministers to account for these targets. So we're hopeful that when the next survey data comes out, there will be even less children who are stunted. And this is, even if stunting is very difficult to tackle, it is an area where you can see results in a relatively short time. Time is flying very quickly. I think we talked about some of these things already around budget allocation and efficiency. I did want to highlight one thing, because I fully agree that 20% of the budget for education is significant, even though if you look at it in percentage of GDP terms, as Professor Lee's chart showed, there is still perhaps room for increasing it, but I fully agree that before doing that, there needs to be further improvements in the quality of that spending. When it comes to public health expenditure as well as social protection spending, it is my own view that Indonesia is still spending less than it could and less than it should, and certainly less than many of its peers. One of the challenges, Ibu Sri Mulyani, again, to go back to what she said this morning, she said, we need to understand not just what we should do and what the problem is, but how can we address it. One of the challenges as well in Indonesia is that the huge amount of money, of rupiah, that is spent on both health and education is highly decentralized. About 70% of the resources goes down to local governments. Local governments spread across not 17,000 islands, but many thousand of the 17,000 islands, with very high variation in terms of connectivity, capacity, accessibility. So some of the challenges that we're seeing are managerial challenges. There's no system to adequately plan, adequately budget, adequately report. Even the Ministry of Finance here in Jakarta has very limited information, actually, of what a lot of this 70%, I see Padrianto is nodding, and without having that system, having that managerial capacity, you're going to struggle to achieve some of these targets. I also wanted to highlight the issue of food prices, because it was mentioned this morning by Professor Lawrence, and it is a big issue in Jakarta. I think part of it is agricultural productivity, part of it is trade related. But the fact is, no matter what the reason is, that Indonesian consumers pay, for example, 70% more for rice than consumers in the greater Mekong region. Jakarta is the most expensive capital city in emerging Asia for fruits and vegetables. Our team did some work and analysis that show that a basket of fruits and vegetables in Jakarta is almost twice as expensive as in Singapore, and Singapore has no agriculture. So you are paying a lot for food here, and that impacts, of course, also on human capital. So how can Indonesia transform its human capital? And this will only be, I think, a teaser of the how, but we could discuss further in the Q&A. I want to highlight this part, though, because when President Jokowi highlights human capital, when Ibu Sri Mulyani comes and talks to you about economic transformation, and she put such a big focus on human capital, and when that is then translated into budget allocation, when then that is then translated into accountability and holding the individual ministers and agencies accountable, because a lot of these are very complex areas of investment that requires coordination across, this leadership is key. And we saw it in the stunting program. It is my dream that something similar could be done for education. Because education, even if it might sound as an education sector problem, it's much more than that. It involves planning, it involves finance, it involves the bureaucracy ministry, it involves home affairs, because a lot of it is decentralized. So a similar type of movement for education would be my dream to see, and I'm very hopeful that with the direction that we're seeing, that might happen. I'm also very positive that I have some very strong signals that human capital will be a central theme in the next ARPA-JMN, which of course we know that will set the direction of the next government's policies and programs. Of course, it's important to continue to reform the supply and demand side human development programs. It's not only about managerial capacity and cross-cutting areas. There are also some key programs that are very important. Comprehensive education reform, for me, is probably at the top of the list. And to include strengthening governance and capacity of that sector, as well as improving teacher quality. Of course, learning happens in the classroom. The teacher is key, and he or she needs to have both the resources and the support required, as well as the knowledge and skills. Also, we talked a lot about labor market and skills development in the previous speech, and there is a lot, I think, that Indonesia can also continue to do to better prepare the new entrance into the labor market for the labor market of the future. And for those who are not able to participate, who are vulnerable, who are poor, disabled, there needs to be a solid social protection system that makes everyone resilient to shocks, but that also has an important role of supporting those poorest and most vulnerable to become economically mobile and to move upwards. This is a bit more detail on some of these issues. I think I've touched on a lot of this already, and because I'm running out of time, I think I'll skip through this one. So I was asked to talk a little bit as well about how technology and innovation could be used to transform human capital. And to be honest, I feel a bit at a disadvantage because it's not really my field. But I do know that there is a lot of international experience, and there is a lot of Indonesia knowledge that has a lot of potential to be able to accelerate outcomes in human capital, and also some of the intervention to be implemented faster and better. This just shows a little bit of what you're working with, right? You have a huge population that, despite some connectivity challenges, you have a huge amount of internet users, mobile connections, smartphone users, and you all spend a lot of time every day on the internet on your phones. You know, so it means that a lot of the basics are there. This is a graph that I stole from McKinsey, and even if it's not directly linked to human capital, I wanted to put it out there because I think that it should be much more linked to human capital, at least when you talk about, you know, robotics, or you talk about, you know, innovative technology, artificial intelligence, or blockchain, or, you know, mobile application. We need to use that more, not just for private sector services, but also for human capital development. So I wanted to put that out there and say, you know, we should do one of these that's human capital focused, and I think, you know, it could probably be as crowded as this one. Here are some international experiences that I just wanted to highlight. There's only 3 out of many. Drone delivery for human capital development. Usually when I say, you know, drones for human capital, people don't really know what I'm talking about, but there has been experiences in Rwanda where they've used drone technology to deliver blood supplies to very remote areas. We know that there is also potential to use drone technology for example, for Indonesia, that has still a very high tuberculosis problem. That could be, you know, a solution to that for vaccinations and testing. There are, you know, use of tablets in classrooms, both for classroom observation and student assessments. There are telediagnostics, which is something that our team will try to learn a bit more about the Ghana experience, because having traveled to some of the places in eastern Indonesia, it might be worthwhile testing and checking whether this is something that could also be applicable here. Indonesia has really impressive sets of innovations in the private sector. You're familiar with all of this, you know, Gojek, Tokopedia, Lazada. It amazes me every day, the innovation that I see in service delivery in this country. And I think there is a really large potential to build on this, to build on the global experiences that we have on human capital and technology, but also on some of the current solutions that you're not at all thinking about for human capital, but maybe you should. And this is actually one example that I just wanted to put out there, and it's something that is currently being developed by the Ministry of Villages in collaboration with the Vice President's office, building on Gojek. So Gojek, for those of you who don't live in Indonesia, is an amazing app where you can get anything that you want. You can get a car service, you can get food, you can, you know, send someone a package, you can get a pedicure, you can use it for anything. And the Ministry of Villages is now translating this into a GoDesa application, which is really a local service delivery application that can help the village government and the village staff ask for capacity type support from the district government and the central government, help them identify gaps, help them report on gaps and highlight them. And over time, it's also intended that this might also help with some of the other more basic budgeting, reporting challenges. As part of GoDesa, there is also an e-human development worker app that's being developed that will help human development worker in villages identify households with stunted children, identify what their service delivery gaps are, identify what they would need to be able to address stunting in their village, and again, report on it regularly. It's going to allow them to get scorecards and results reports in real time. So I think this is a pretty exciting innovation, and I think there's lots of potential in Indonesia to do more of this. So I wanted to end, but I hope that you're now convinced that stunting is important to do something about if you're going to have economic growth and prosperity in Indonesia in the years to come, and that human capital development is important. And I would love to get, as I said, I'm not the good person to really talk about the technology part, but I would love to get more input and suggestions from those of you who might be more experts on that. Terima kasih.
Thank you, Camilla. Let's now move to question and answer session. You're welcome to submit your questions through Slido, and maybe we will pick some directly from the floor later on. But first, I'd like to invite two persons to give brief observations. The first one is Dr. Turo Wongkaran from Demographics Institute of University of Indonesia. Turo.
Thank you. Nice presentation. I really enjoyed both presentations. The first one is for Professor Lee regarding mismatch. So there are two kinds of mismatch. First is vertical, like the one that you just mentioned. Vertical mismatch, it means that somebody who graduated with a college degree have to fulfill job meant for high school, for instance. So that's what you meant by over-education or under-education. The second one is horizontal. Horizontal mismatch means people's education do not match their current jobs. For instance, somebody graduated from with college degree in agronomics, for instance, but work as a banker. So those happen a lot in Indonesia. Regarding the horizontal mismatch, is it still possible for today's government to create a plan that the education can answer the future job, the future demand for job, knowing how job of the future is really fluid and change. In our experience, we try to ask, for instance, industry, what do you need from us? What kind of skill or employment that you need from education? They cannot answer that because they said, well, we don't really know. We never actually have a plan, for instance, for 5 years or 10 years. That's the first question. The second question, about 98% of business units in Indonesia are small and micro enterprises. So the business units. What kind of educational policy that can actually support industrialization in such situation where there's a lot of informal, there's a lot of small and micro enterprises. And the third one, very quick, is there a minimal benchmark for graduates in STEM so that it can support industrialization? 2%, 4%. Once I calculated, actually Indonesia about 1.9% graduate is in STEM. For Ms. Camilla Holmemo, well, I'm glad that World Bank has the Human Capital Index, and also because it includes education, survival, and health aspect. But from my research, I found that we might also want, so this is only a comment, not a question, we might want also look at the following aspects. The first one is the character traits development. I divide into two, for instance, whether someone has ethics so that they will not get arrested by KPK, for instance. You know what KPK is, yeah. And second, soft skill, which actually World Bank Indonesia already mentioned that what lack in Indonesian workers are the soft skill, not the hard skills. And the second one, so that the first one is character traits, the second one is security. secured from anxiety, for instance, from violent riots, or also from possible discrimination for whatever reason, from gender, from sexual orientation, from any other things. And the second is security for about their future, job safety, health insurance, and so on. So having good education, having a good health might not be enough to be a good human capital. And this is the last for both, actually, also to relate what the minister said this morning. Investment in education, I think, actually affect fiscal policy indirectly. We talk about, we try not to be old before get rich, but if we invest more in fertility, actually, eventually number of youth increase because there's a negative relationship between education and fertility. So when people are, especially women, get more educated, they have less children, and because there are less children, the need for youth-related spending decrease. And because the need for youth spending decrease, government spending can be used for other purposes, including funding social spending for social assistance or social insurance. So I think this is only a message for BKF that please fund programs that actually still reducing the fertility, because it will also investment for the future. Thank you.
Do you mind if I ask for the second? If I ask for the second. Okay, so Ms. Jae-Yoon Ra from UNICEF, can you give your remarks? Thanks.
Sure, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Lee and Camilla, for the very informative presentations. I'm actually coming from a slightly different background. I'm a public health nutritionist now working with UNICEF Indonesia, so my comments very much reflect my background. Although I enjoyed both presentations, my comments are on Camilla's presentation. What I really liked about Camilla's presentation is that it touched upon the various dimensions of human capital. So not just about education and health of the population, but also it touched upon some of the most important basic building blocks of human capital, including nutrition. But it also goes way beyond nutrition, such as issues of early childhood and development, and stimulation, many of the child protection issues, and also food security is an important factor, which should have missed out as well. Well, in terms of nutrition, which is my expertise, what I want to say is that, I just want to echo what Camilla mentioned. So Indonesia currently has one of the world's highest chronic child malnutrition rate. And I won't go into, how child malnutrition impacts human capital development, because Camilla touched upon it during the presentation. It actually has devastating consequences on human capital development. But in addition to what was mentioned, I also want to bring it to the attention of the audience that Indonesia currently has the 4th highest rate of more acute form of malnutrition. And according to the most recent data, it has been shown that more than 50% of pregnant mothers are anemic, and therefore they are more likely to give birth to low birth weight babies, just continuing this intergenerational cycle, vicious cycle of malnutrition. But on top of that, Indonesia actually has one of the world's highest sort of rapidly increasing rate of obesity, overweight and obesity. And so without taking appropriate actions, obesity and overweight prevalence is likely to be very high in the near future. And when it comes to the impact of malnutrition on human capital, it's not just about undernutrition, but we also have to remember that overweight and obesity has equal impact on human capital and economic development of the country as well. So I think it really needs urgent attention, and these building blocks of human capital should not be overlooked. My second related comment, which I'm going to keep it short, is very much also echoing what Camilla mentioned. So whenever we talk about this, various building blocks of human capital, it includes multiple issues: nutrition, ECD, child protection. There are many other issues. So oftentimes we actually compete with each other, trying to get our agenda onto the budget allocation and so on. Something that I want to sort of maybe also open it up for discussion is, earlier there was a discussion on, is it just about budget allocation, or is it whether we need to use the allocated budget in a more efficient manner? In my humble opinion, I think it's both. As Camilla mentioned, although Indonesia is currently spending 20% of budget on education, according to very recent analysis that UNICEF carried out, we actually found that less than 1% of health sector budget is actually being spent on nutrition services, where the country has such a high burden of nutrition issues. Another issue that I want to mention is that although Indonesia is spending 20% of its budget on education, currently we don't provide solid school feeding, school meal programs to adolescents and school children. So according to a recent analysis that UNICEF conducted, we actually found that a large proportion of children and adolescents are coming to school empty stomach without having breakfast, which obviously has impact on their learning ability, outcomes, and so on and so forth. So I think we really need to revisit in terms of how do we also spend the allocated amount of budget in each sector as well. And just lastly, I just want to also pose a question to Camilla, because you were going to talk about how do we improve the capacity, managerial capacity, especially at subnational level, which I think is an extremely important issue. So if you can elaborate on that, I think that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we'll start with you, Jong. Yes.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for excellent comment and suggestions and questions. I think they are very important issues. I want to just make very simple answers. First of all, in terms of this reducing skill mismatch, you cannot really design everything in the very early. I think it's because the environment is changing so quickly. So what we should do is sometimes we need to design certain institutions which will make the people get into the new field more easily. So what I'm saying is sometimes you need to design some kind of training mechanism. You are not really trained for current jobs. You can be trained for the future jobs, which would be more profitable. So you belong to the one sector after graduation, but you now realize that in 5 years, there are better opportunities in the other fields. So we need to encourage them to get into the another areas. I mean, which we cannot design from the school. I mean, but this kind of mechanism, sometimes like some countries designed, for example, Singapore has a certain money they could spend for their own training. They can just claim the money from the government. And then they could be trained everywhere for their future jobs. They can just, they are working in the agriculture sector, but they can train for the ICT education. So this kind of things, they have $500, if I remember correctly, for every year. Another issue is the small and medium enterprise, and this issue, especially we have a very small enterprise in many Asian countries. This is a really limit for skill training as well as the industrial development. I think it requires a set of deliberate policies. For example, we need to make this small enterprise to get access to the financing and the markets, and then we also need to provide the training for them to get into the much better the industries. I mean, these kind of things we cannot really done in a few years. I mean, so Korea is also now experiencing a lot of problems in handling the inefficient small and medium enterprises and the self-employed. So everywhere we have the same problems. The question is how to set the priority. What would be the government role? The government cannot solve all the problems. You need to find out the most effective areas government can do, and then we need to provide some mechanisms then private sectors can do their own way of their way to improve the situations. I think it's, the last point is the malnutrition issues. I didn't discuss healthy issues because the health is also very important part of human capital. But I knew Camilla would say about that, so I didn't say it.
Thank you, Jung-Hwan. Camilla, yours.
Thank you. Maybe just a comment back on your comment or a bit of a response, because you mentioned that the Human Capital Index currently has a very basic set of indicators, and is that really sufficient to be able to measure correlations and cover everything that's important for adult productivity, for growth? And I think the short answer is no. It's definitely not. It does not include an exhaustive list of indicators that are correlated to adult productivity. But a lot of the work that our economists did show that these were the ones that, across all the countries that we worked on, had a very strong correlation between their value and adult productivity. But this really also depends on what type of country you are, right? So for Indonesia, for example, the stunting measure is meaningful because unfortunately you have a stunting problem. For many of the other countries, there are other types of indicators that would have a more meaningful measure of adult productivity. And a lot of the middle income, upper middle income, high income countries gave specific feedback that can you do some work and see if you can reflect some measure of skills or higher education, because for us that's really important, and the current Human Capital Index only focuses on the early years of life. So that's something that, you might see that in the Human Capital Index 2.0, but for now, it's really focused on those early years of investments. And then to Yi's questions, how to improve capacity and management at local level. That's a very big question. I'm not going to pretend that I have the answer, but I have a few, there are a few basic things that I think needs to be addressed in Indonesia. And one of them is just basic system reform. So you have a 514 district government, you have 75,000 villages. There is a lack of an effective system of data collection, data use, proper planning and budgeting and reporting down at those local levels. So a pretty sort of basic management information and data system reform or intervention, I would argue, would be needed. I also think there is an important element that's missing a bit now of accountability, and the two are related because of the lack of data, local governments and villages keep getting the transfers, keep getting the resources, even when they're not fulfilling some of their most basic functions. So if there's a way to create some system of accountability, make some of the fiscal transfers performance-based, and I'm not necessarily talking about attaching them to, an improved PISA score, because that might be counterproductive. But at least do your basic reporting, do your basic data collection. Have a management system in place, and you could look at ways of linking fiscal transfers to that, and then over time you might be more ambitious in the type of results that you tie it to. And then another obvious one is human resources, because we talked a lot today about the importance of skills development and skills jobs mismatch. And I think that's very much true for the public sector as well. It's not just a private sector problem where the private sector is not getting the type of sort of harder skills or ICT skills, which I myself highlighted in my presentation. But it's also that the learning crisis in the education system very much affects the human resources of the public sector as well.
Our time is up, but we have 4 questions there from Slido, so let's just do it very quickly. It seems to me that the first 2 questions are for you, Professor Lee. So first one is, can you explain more on how the Korean government deals with TFET and the associated incentives? And what are the incentives for companies to invest in R&D?
Well, I know we are behind the schedule, so dinner will come soon. So I'll be very quick answering those questions. First one is maybe the couple of things. It's a very complicated story, but I want to emphasize two things. First of all, the government should make projections of labor demand and supply by industry for long term, at least like 5 years and 10 years. That's the first step, because you need some numbers, basically. Otherwise, you cannot just say, oh, we need the skilled labor for the future in 5 years. Okay, let's increase 20%. Well, look at the high school and tertiary schools. What kind of the subject? What kind of disciplines? Do you need more doctors? Do you need more physicists? Well, you need to know. I mean, do you want to focus more on engineering sector versus science? This kind of social science, humanities. I mean, this kind of things. At least we need some numbers. So this Korea did. When they designed the national development economic plans, they need the 5-year projections of or further, and then you need some incentives. They ask you about incentives for the training system. TBS system is especially. You need to look at the more market failure case. I mean, you cannot do everything. So, for example, training teachers in Korea was done mostly by the government. So, government set up these teachers, schools for trainers, basically for TBS. I mean, these kind of things government could do in advance to educate the good teachers for the future demand for TBS. I mean, these kind of things require some advanced plans. And then so finance is very important. So government made some schemes, like large firms will pay certain amount of the money to the fund, and then the fund will use for the TBS system, not just for their own people, but also for the small and medium enterprise. I mean, you need some kind of mechanisms. R&D incentives, basically tax exemption was the key, and then also the educating more R&D personnel was government spend a lot of effort. And then the last thing is empirically we use the most case 5-year time lag. If you invest in human capital, the impact will show up within 5 years. So sometimes you'll be surprised because these people will go to the labor market in 10 years and 20 years. The outcome will show up in 10 years, 20 years. But this kind of expectation of the supply of the skilled labor will stimulate physical capital accumulation in a few years. I mean, and then especially foreign direct investment will come to the countries by expecting better skilled labor in the future. I mean, so this kind of interactions between human capital and technology and physical capital accumulation would be important. So sometimes the leg is not that long. I mean, as long as the government and then the society is really committed to develop very good quality student, very good quality workers for the future, the money will come, and sometimes more investment for the technology will come. And then, so these kind of things will have, as I said, the virtuous cycle of the economic and human development.
Thank you. Camilla, there are 2 questions. How many years do you think Indonesia can reap the benefit from human? You have these dreadful numbers of 150 years to catch up for the groups. So if we invest, do you think we can cut that number?
I definitely think you can do better than 150 years. I'm not able to tell you exactly how many years, but I can, maybe try to illustrate a bit with some numbers as well. So I think on stunting, I think Indonesia, with its current very impressive and highly resourced, highly coordinated stunting program, has the potential to reduce its stunting rates very quickly. And we have global experiences of this. We have, Peru, who have its stunting rate in, I think less than a decade, using, many of the same approaches that Indonesia has. So I think I'm optimistic that you will see a big dent in your stunting rates. On education, I don't think it's going to take 150 years. And actually, there is a very good opportunity emerging in the coming years that I think will enable Indonesia to get maybe even quicker results. And it's related to the quality of teachers, which is key. They're the ones, in the classroom teaching the children. And 50% of Indonesia's teachers are going to retire in the next 10 years. So if you can really focus on preparing the next set of teachers, the teachers currently in school, you have, I think, a great potential to really accelerate the test scores, but that's just an indicator, right? What you really want are students who are learning and happy and able to, because of that, get a good job and get a good salary, and then provide for their own children better. That being said, some of these investments are long-term, right? Because if you reduce stunting now, it's not going to have a real-time effect on productivity and growth, because these children are not going to work for another 15, 16, 20 years, right? So it is also a long-term investment. But I don't think that in any way takes away from the urgency, because 20 years will be here before you know it, and you want to be prepared. You want your kids to be able to have those opportunities.
Yeah, the last one there is about the causes of the ineffective use of the budget for education. Do you think, do you know any causes for that?
So I think it's a number. There are a number of factors. One of them is that the decentralized system, while it has many advantages, also really require, I think, higher capacity of the local government than what is currently there, right? With 2/3 of resources going down to the local level, it means that it's the local governments, it's the district governments who are really responsible for the quality of their education. And I think they lack a lot of the capacity to do that. Again, in terms of systems, in terms of their ability to support schools, to support teacher development, teacher training in service is actually a decentralized function as well. So if you don't have that capacity, then you're not going to be able to upskill your teachers. And then it's another area also, it's pre-service training of teachers, where still the teachers who are coming out of the current system could have a better training, could be better prepared, could be better able to transfer their skills to students. And that's why I'm hopeful that if some reforms could be done there with 50% retiring, that's a really big opportunity. And then I think it's also at the national level, as I talked a bit about in my presentation, it's also recognizing that this isn't just a sort of a Ministry of Education agenda. It's actually an agenda that requires that coordinated push and that creation of accountability. Because you have 514 local governments, but then you have Ministry of Education, you have the Ministry of Religious Affairs that actually teaches 15% of all the students. You have the Ministry of Bureaucracy educating the teachers. You have the Ministry of Home Affairs responsible for in-service training. You have the Ministry of Higher Education, of Research and Technology. So if all of those could come together around a reform plan. But that's not easy, but Indonesia did it for stunting.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry we don't have more time for more questions, so please join me in thanking our excellent speaker.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, the token of appreciations is given by Mr. Parjono as the Director of Center for Climate Finance and Multilateral Policy Fiscal Policy Agency. So we'd like to say thank you one more time to our speakers, Mr. Jong Wali from Korean University, and also Mrs. Camilla Holmemo from World Bank, and also for our moderator. Thank you very much. Can I get a round of big applause for our speakers and moderator, Mr. Arianto Patunru from Australian National University. Thank you very much for the photo session. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much one more time. So ladies and gentlemen, so this is the end of our first day of today. So I would like to inform you that tonight